Get out my property. This is my barn, not a campground, I yelled when I saw the HOA group setting up tents, building fires, and stretching tarps right next to my livestock barn like it was some public playground. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, waved her hand and declared this was unrestricted common land. But she had no idea that tomorrow morning was when I released my cattle and horses to pasture. When the sun came up, over 100 animals charged out like a four-legged tsunami, heading straight for their camp, which now looked like a battlefield. Hey, by the way, where are you watching the story from? Drop a comment, I want to know how far this knockout punch has spread. And trust me, the moment Karen climbed on top of a car to dodge a charging cow will have you laughing until you can't breathe. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my farm when I first heard the commotion. I'd been out in the East Pasture, checking on the fence posts that Emma and I had installed together just 2 years ago, back when she was still dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. The memory hit me like it always did, a sharp ache in my chest that never quite went away. Emma had been gone for 8 months now, taken by brain cancer at just 16, and every corner of this 200-acre farm held echoes of her laughter. She'd loved the animals more than anything, especially our prize Holstein, Bessie, who still looked toward the farmhouse every morning as if expecting to see Emma running out with treats. I was walking back toward the barn when I heard voices, too many voices, coming from the direction of my livestock area. At first, I thought maybe some neighbors had stopped by. But as I got closer, the scene that unfolded before me made my blood pressure spike. 8 to 10 people were setting up what looked like a full camping expedition right next to my barn. Tents were going up, someone was digging a fire pit, and a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair was directing the operation like she owned the place. The woman wore a crisp white blazer despite the rural setting, and something about her demeanor screamed authority complex. What caught my attention, though, was the equipment they had with them. For a camping trip, they sure had some unusual gear. I spotted what looked like a professional geological measuring device and detailed topographical maps spread across a folding table. I approached the group with my hands in my pockets, trying to keep my voice level and polite. Excuse me, folks, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is private property. You're camping right next to my livestock barn. The blonde woman turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was probably in her early 50s with the kind of composure that came from years of getting her way. You must be Ethan Coalfield, she said, extending a manicured hand. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. We're exercising our right to access unrestricted common land. I stared at her for a moment, wondering if I'd heard correctly. Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't common land. This is my farm. I've got the deed and property taxes to prove it. Karen's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Mr. Coalfield, I think you'll find that the land surveys from 1987 show this particular area was never properly enclosed or claimed. We've done our research. She gestured toward one of her companions, a nervous-looking man in his 30s who was fumbling with a folder of documents. We have every right to be here, and we intend to exercise that right. The way she said it made my skin crawl. There was something rehearsed about her response, like she'd been preparing for this conversation. I noticed that several members of her camping group were watching our exchange with unusual intensity, and none of them looked like typical outdoor enthusiasts. One guy had hands that looked like they'd never held anything rougher than a computer keyboard, yet he was wearing expensive hiking boots that still had the store tags. Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know what research you think you've done, but I guarantee you, this is private property. My family has owned this land for 3 generations. I could feel my temper starting to rise, but I kept my voice steady. Emma had always told me that angry words never solved anything, and I could almost hear her voice reminding me to stay calm. I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and move along. Karen's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, her facade cracked just enough to show something calculating underneath. Mr. Coalfield, are you certain your property documentation is up to date? Because we'd hate for there to be any complications regarding your land ownership status. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and it hit me like a cold slap. This wasn't some innocent misunderstanding about property lines. These people had come here with a purpose, and they'd done their homework about me and my farm. I glanced around at the group again, noting details I'd missed before. Several of them had Virginia license plates, which was odd since we were in Ohio. The camping equipment looked brand new and expensive, but none of them seemed to know how to use it properly. Most telling of all, the geological equipment and maps suggested they weren't here for recreational camping at all. Karen seemed to sense my growing suspicion. Mr. Coalfield will be here for several days conducting our assessment. I suggest you review your property documentation carefully. As I walked back toward my house, my mind was racing. Something was very wrong with this situation, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. These people weren't ordinary HOA busybodies. They had an agenda, and somehow my farm was part of it. What bothered me was how much Karen seemed to know about me and my property. The confidence in her voice when she mentioned my documentation suggested she'd already researched my land ownership thoroughly. I decided to call my neighbor, Agnes Murphy, who'd lived in the area for 40 years and had a sharp eye for anything unusual. Double quotes Agnes, it's Ethan. Have you noticed any strangers around lately? People asking questions about property lines or land surveys. There was a pause before Agnes responded. Funny you should ask, honey. I've been seeing some unusual activity around your place for the past few months, people with surveying equipment, taking pictures and measuring things. I thought maybe you were planning some kind of construction project. My heart sank as Inez's words confirmed my worst suspicions. These people had been watching my farm for months, planning whatever this was. They knew my schedule, my property layout, and probably a lot more about my situation than I was comfortable with. As I hung up the phone and looked out my kitchen window toward the barn, I could see the glow of their campfire and hear their voices carrying on the evening air. Tomorrow morning, I had to release my cattle and horses to the east pasture, just like I did every day at dawn. It was part of the routine Emma and I had established, and I'd never broken it, not even during the hardest days after her funeral. But now I had a problem. These uninvited guests had set up camp directly in the path my livestock took to reach their grazing area. What Karen Whitmore didn't know was that my 150 head of cattle and horses didn't exactly take their time when heading to pasture. They moved like a force of nature, and anything in their path was going to get trampled or scattered. Maybe it was time these trespassers learned exactly what rural living really meant. But as I settled in for what would be a restless night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this camping expedition was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple property dispute. Karen Whitmore had made a mistake coming to my farm, but I was starting to suspect I didn't yet understand just how big a mistake it was. I was up before dawn, just like every day for the past 3 years. The routine was sacred to me. Emma and I had started together when she was 13 and wanted to help with the morning chores. Even now, 8 months after losing her, I couldn't bring myself to change the schedule. At exactly 5:30 a.m., I walked to the main barn and began opening the gates that separated my livestock from their daily paradise. What happened next was something Karen Whitmore and her fake camping expedition hadn't researched in all their careful planning. The first gate opened with its familiar creak, and I could hear the stirring inside the barn. My cattle and horses knew the routine as well as I did. Bessie, my lead Holstein, was already at the front, her massive head turning toward the pasture with anticipation. Behind her, 149 other animals were gathering momentum like a freight train building steam. I stepped aside and pulled the main gate wide open, just as I had done every morning since Emma's death. What followed was nature's version of a cavalry charge. The entire herd burst from the barn like a four-legged tsunami, hooves thundering against the earth with the power of a small earthquake. Bessie led the charge with the confidence of a general, followed by my quarter horses and the rest of the cattle in a magnificent stampede toward their daily grazing ground. Karen's camping setup was positioned directly in the path between the barn and the east pasture, and her group had never experienced anything like this. The first person to notice the approaching thunder was a thin man in expensive hiking gear who had been tending their campfire. He looked up from his coffee cup, saw the wall of charging animals, and let out a scream that could have shattered glass. "Holy ... run," he yelled, abandoning his breakfast and sprinting toward the nearest vehicle. Within seconds, the entire camp erupted into chaos. Tents collapsed as people dove for cover, camping chairs went flying, and expensive equipment scattered like leaves in a hurricane. I watched from my position by the barn gate, arms crossed, as Karen's carefully planned operation dissolved into complete pandemonium. Karen herself provided the most entertaining spectacle of the morning. Instead of panicking like her companions, she shouted orders with the fury of a general whose battle plan had gone wrong. "Document this. Get it on camera," she screamed while scrambling onto the hood of a black SUV. Her white blazer was already dirt-stained, and her perfectly styled hair looked like she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket. From her elevated position, she continued barking commands to her scattered team, like a general whose army was in full retreat. "This is assault with livestock. Get every second on video." What struck me as particularly interesting was how organized their retreat was, despite the chaos. These people might have been caught off guard, but they moved with a coordination that suggested they'd worked together before. As my livestock thundered past the remains of their camp, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of it all. Bessie, my gentle giant, had knocked over their expensive geological equipment with the casual indifference of a queen dismissing peasants. The topographical maps they'd been studying so carefully were now trampled into the mud, and their high-tech measuring devices were scattered across 20 yards of pasture. Emma would have loved this moment. I could almost hear her laughter echoing across the farm as she watched these city folks getting a real education in rural living. "That's what you get for messing with our cows, Dad," she would have said with that mischievous grin that always made my heart swell with pride, but even as I enjoyed the immediate satisfaction of watching Karen's group scramble for safety, something nagged at the back of my mind. The man who had screamed first was now recording everything on his phone, just as Karen had ordered. They weren't just documenting their humiliation. They were building a case. This wasn't the random bad luck of amateur campers who had chosen the wrong spot. This was a calculated move in a larger game I didn't yet understand. The way Karen had immediately thought to preserve evidence, the professional quality of their equipment, and their coordinated response all pointed to something much more serious than a simple property dispute. Agnes Murphy appeared at my side as the last of my animals cleared the camp area and headed toward their pasture. She'd been watching from her kitchen window and had hurried over to see the aftermath. "Well, that was something," she said with a chuckle, surveying the destroyed campsite. "Though I don't think this is the end of it, honey. I've been doing some thinking about what you told me yesterday, and I've got something you need to see." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos she'd taken over the past 3 months. "I started taking pictures when I noticed strangers around your property. Look at this one from last week." The photo showed Karen and 2 men in business suits standing at the edge of my property with surveying equipment. But what caught my attention was the audio recording Agnes had captured. In it, I could hear Karen speaking Spanish with the fluency of someone who'd grown up with the language, and her tone was completely different from the authoritative HOA president persona she'd shown me. She sounded like someone giving orders to subordinates, and the conversation had nothing to do with a homeowner association. As I looked at the wreckage of their camp and processed what Agnes had shown me, a cold realization settled in my stomach. Karen Whitmore and her group weren't just some power-hungry HOA looking to expand their territory. They were something much more dangerous, and my little stampede had just declared war on people who probably didn't fight fair, the way they'd scattered but immediately regrouped to document everything, the professional equipment mixed with the camping facade, and now on Nez's evidence of their surveillance operation painted a picture that made my blood run cold. But I had also learned something important about them. Despite all their planning and research, they hadn't expected the livestock. They'd underestimated what it meant to mess with a working farm, and that gave me hope if they could make one mistake, they could make others. The question was whether I'd be smart enough to catch them before they caught me. By noon, Karen's revenge was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. The video of my livestock charging through their camp had somehow been edited to make it look like I deliberately released a stampede of angry animals on innocent campers. The caption read, "Violent farmer attacks peaceful HOA members with cattle," and it already had 50,000 views on Facebook. Karen had positioned herself as the victim of rural aggression, complete with dramatic footage of her perched on the SUV. While my cows thundered past, the comment section was a battlefield, with people taking sides based on 30 seconds of carefully edited footage that told only half the story. I sat in my kitchen, scrolling through the viral post on my laptop, feeling a mixture of anger and amazement at how quickly public opinion could be manipulated. The video started right at the moment my animals burst from the barn, completely omitting the fact that Karen's group had been illegally camping on my property for hours. Her narrative painted me as an unhinged farmer who used livestock as weapons against law-abiding citizens exercising their rights. This is exactly the kind of rural extremism that threatens community safety, Karen had written in her post. Mr. Coalfield's violent response to our peaceful land assessment shows the dangerous mentality of property owners who think they're above the law. The video had been professionally edited with slow-motion shots of the animals and dramatic music. That made it look like a scene from an action movie, rather than the routine morning feeding I'd been doing for years. What got under my skin was how many people were buying into her version of events without question. Comments poured in from urbanites who'd never set foot on a working farm, calling me everything from a psychotic rancher to a domestic terrorist with hooves. But there were also plenty of rural folks who could smell the BS from a mile away. "Lady, that's what happens when you camp in front of a barn," wrote one commenter. "Those animals have got to eat, and they aren't going to wait for your permission." Another person posted, "I've lived on farms my whole life. This is a normal daily routine. You camped in the wrong place." Karen. The divide was clear, city versus country, and Karen was playing it perfectly to maximize outrage and sympathy. I decided to fight fire with fire. I pulled up my own social media account, which I hadn't used since Emma's funeral, and started crafting my response. I uploaded the security camera footage from my barn, which showed Karen's group arriving in the dark and setting up their camp despite the clear private property signs. The timestamp proved they'd been there for hours before I released the animals, and you could see their expensive surveying equipment being unloaded. "Here's what happened," I wrote. "These people trespassed on my farm, ignored private property signs, and set up camp directly in the path my livestock takes to pasture every single morning at 5:30 a.m. This isn't violence. It's basic farm operations. If you camp in front of a barn, you're going to meet the animals that live there." My video response gained traction quickly, shared by farming communities and rural advocacy groups across the Midwest. The original security footage was damning evidence that Karen's group had deliberately chosen their location despite obvious warning signs. You could even see them pointing at my barn and discussing something while setting up their tents, which suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. Within a few hours, the comment war had evolved into a full-scale social media battle between Karen's supporters and people who understood rural life. The hashtag Stampede Justice started trending locally, with people sharing their own stories of entitled city folks who didn't understand country living. But as I monitored the online discussion, something strange caught my attention. Many of the accounts supporting Karen had been created recently, and their profiles looked suspiciously similar. The profile pictures were stock photos, the bios were generic, and their comment histories showed they only participated in controversies like this one. I started taking screenshots and noticed a pattern. Dozens of fake accounts were amplifying Karen's message while attacking anyone who questioned her story. Someone had spent serious money on a coordinated social media campaign to control the narrative. This wasn't just an angry HOA president lashing out after being embarrassed. This was a professional operation designed to destroy my reputation and credibility. Tommy Hayes, a local blogger who covered rural issues, reached out to me through Facebook Messenger that evening. "Ethan, I've been following this story, and there's something fishy about the whole thing. Would you be willing to talk on the record? I think there's more to this Karen Whitmore situation than meets the eye." Tommy had a reputation for thorough investigative work, and his blog, Heartland Truth, was respected throughout the farming community. I agreed to meet with him the next day, sensing that I might finally have found an ally who could help me dig deeper into whatever Karen was really up to. But as I closed my laptop that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the social media war was just the beginning. My phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Rick Stone, an old friend who worked for the county sheriff's department. "Ethan, just got word that someone filed a formal complaint about the livestock incident. Might want to call a lawyer. This isn't going away quietly." I stared at the message, realizing that Karen's next move was already in motion. She wasn't content with just winning the propaganda war online. She was taking this fight into the legal system, where fake social media accounts wouldn't help me. As I looked out my kitchen window toward the barn where Emma and I had spent so many happy mornings, I wondered what my daughter would think about the storm that was gathering around our little farm. Tommy Hayes arrived at my farm the next morning with a laptop bag and the determined look of a journalist who'd caught the scent of a real story. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Emma used to do her homework while keeping an eye on the animals through the window. Tommy was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and a notebook that looked like it had seen some serious investigative work. "Ethan, I've been digging into this Meadowbrook Heights HOA situation, and nothing about it adds up," he said, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "For starters, there's no record of this HOA being properly registered with the county. The paperwork exists, but it's full of irregularities that would make any legitimate attorney nervous." Tommy spread out financial documents across my table, pointing to highlighted sections that looked like hieroglyphics to me. "Look at this. They've spent over $200,000 on something called landscape assessment and community enhancement, but there's no record of any actual work being done. The money just disappears into accounts belonging to shell companies that don't seem to exist. Beyond a P.O. box in Delaware." He showed me bank statements that revealed a web of financial transactions between the HOA and companies with names like Midwest Development Solutions and Rural Acquisition Partners. None of these companies had websites, physical addresses, or any legitimate business presence that Tommy could find. The money trail led nowhere, which, in Tommy's experience, meant it was leading somewhere important. What caught my attention was Tommy's research into the individual HOA members who'd shown up at my farm. "I ran background checks on everyone I could identify from your security footage," he explained, sliding photos across the table. "Half of these people have criminal records related to fraud, money laundering, and organized crime. The guy who screamed and ran first, his name is Marcus Webb, and he's got convictions for real estate fraud in 3 different states." Tommy's investigation revealed that Karen's HOA board wasn't a collection of concerned homeowners, but a carefully assembled team of con artists and white-collar criminals. Each member brought specific skills: financial manipulation, legal intimidation, and what appeared to be expertise in property acquisition through questionable means. The most disturbing discovery came when Tommy showed me aerial photos of other farms in the region. 3 other farmers in a 50-mile radius have had similar problems with mysterious HOA groups in the past year, he said, pointing to properties marked with red circles on a county map. In each case, the farmers were subjected to legal harassment, social media attacks, and property disputes that eventually forced them to sell their land at below-market prices. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen's operation was part of a systematic campaign to acquire rural properties through intimidation and legal manipulation. What made it even more sophisticated was that each HOA used different names and slightly different tactics, making it difficult to connect them unless someone was looking for the pattern. Agnes Murphy knocked on my door just as Tommy was showing me the most damning evidence. She'd brought more photos and what looked like a small recording device. "Sorry to interrupt, boys, but I thought you should see this right away," she said, settling into the chair next to Tommy with the confidence of someone who'd been investigating this situation longer than any of us realized. Agnes had been using her position as the neighborhood busybody to document everything, and her evidence was more comprehensive than I'd imagined. She'd photographed not only the surveying activities, but also late-night meetings between Karen and men in expensive suits who weren't from our rural community. "Here's the interesting part," Agnes continued, playing an audio recording on her phone. "I heard Karen talking to someone on her cell phone yesterday after your livestock incident. She was speaking Spanish again, but I had my neighbor Maria translate it for me." The conversation revealed that Karen was reporting to someone she called El Jefe about complications with the coal field acquisition. She'd mentioned needing to accelerate the timeline and requested additional resources to eliminate the resistance. The tone of the conversation suggested that Karen wasn't at the top of this operation's food chain, but rather a middle manager reporting to someone with significantly more power and resources. Tommy's eyes lit up as he listened to Inez's recording. "This is the missing piece," he said, pulling out his laptop and connecting to my internet. "I've been trying to trace the money behind these fake HOAs, and it's been leading to some very interesting places, dead ends that look suspiciously like they're designed to hide something big." He showed us a spreadsheet that tracked financial connections between all the fraudulent HOA operations in our region. The pattern suggested they were all funded by the same source, channeled through an increasingly complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Tommy had found similar operations in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, all targeting rural properties with specific geographic and geological characteristics. "I think we're looking at something much bigger than property fraud," Tommy said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The properties they're targeting all share certain features: isolated locations, access to major highways, and underground geological formations that would be perfect for, well, let's just say activities that require privacy and good drainage." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. We weren't dealing with simple real estate scammers looking to flip farmland for profit. This was a coordinated operation targeting specific properties for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate development. As I looked around my kitchen, the same room where Emma had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian and helping animals, I realized that our little farm had somehow become ground zero in a conflict I was only beginning to understand. That evening, I found myself alone in Emma's old room, going through the boxes of her belongings that I still couldn't bring myself to pack away permanently. She'd always been fascinated by our farm's history, spending hours in the county library researching previous owners and old land surveys. As I opened her desk drawer, looking for anything that might help Tommy's investigation, my fingers found a manila envelope labeled "Cool Farm Stuff, Dad's Land History" in her careful handwriting. Inside were photocopies of geological surveys from the 1980s that I'd never seen before, along with Emma's notes about underground limestone caves that ran beneath our property. The geological report was fascinating in a way that made my blood run cold. According to the survey, our farm sat on top of an extensive network of natural underground tunnels and caverns formed by centuries of water erosion through the limestone bedrock. Emma had highlighted sections that described these formations as ideal for storage applications requiring temperature control and concealment from surface detection. She'd also found historical records showing that during Prohibition, bootleggers had used similar cave systems throughout the Midwest to hide illegal alcohol operations. What chilled me was a handwritten note in the margin that said, "Why did Mr. Marcus ask me about the caves last summer?" followed by a question mark and a sad face emoji. Marcus, the same name Karen had whispered in Spanish during her phone call with El Jefe. The same name Agnes had overheard in conversations about accelerating timelines. I called Tommy immediately, my hand shaking as I held Emma's research. "Tommy, I found something that changes everything." Emma documented conversations with someone named Marcus who was asking about underground caves on our property. This was months before she died. Tommy's silence on the other end told me he was processing the same horrifying implications I was grappling with. These people hadn't just recently discovered my farm. They'd been planning this operation while my daughter was still alive, possibly even using her innocent curiosity about our land's history to gather intelligence. The next morning brought a revelation that made the cave discovery look like a warm-up act. Agnes called at dawn, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "Ethan, you need to get over here right now. I found something in my late husband's papers that explains everything." I drove to Inez's house in record time, finding her in her kitchen with old file boxes spread across every surface. Her husband had been a civil engineer who'd worked on infrastructure projects throughout the Midwest before his death 5 years ago. "Look at this," she said, handing me a construction blueprint marked "Confidential, Federal Project 1987. The document detailed the construction of a sophisticated underground facility beneath what I recognized as my farm's eastern boundary. The blueprint revealed a network of reinforced concrete tunnels connecting natural cave systems designed for what the document euphemistically called strategic material storage and distribution. Agnes pointed to signatures on the approval forms, including one that made my stomach drop. "Marcus Whitmore, project engineer." Marcus wasn't just Karen's husband, Agnes explained, her voice barely above a whisper. He was the engineer who designed and built an underground drug manufacturing and distribution center right under your property 35 years ago. The facility was supposedly decommissioned in 1991, but according to these documents, the infrastructure was just sealed, not destroyed. Tommy arrived 20 minutes later, and when I showed him the blueprints and Emma's geological research, his face went pale. Jesus Christ, Ethan, this isn't about real estate or even drug distribution. Karen is trying to resurrect the largest underground drug manufacturing operation in federal history. He pulled out his laptop and began cross-referencing the facility's original specifications with modern drug production requirements. The underground complex had been designed with sophisticated ventilation systems, power generation capabilities, and multiple access points that would be perfect for a large-scale manufacturing operation. With today's technology and chemistry, this facility could produce enough fentanyl and methamphetamines to supply half the country. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Rick Stone called me that afternoon with news that made everything click into place. Ethan, I've been working with some folks at the state level on your situation, and we just got word from the D. They've been tracking a multi-state drug operation that's been buying up rural properties through fraudulent HOA schemes. Your farm isn't just one target, it's the crown jewel. According to their intelligence, whoever's running this operation has been planning to build what they're calling the Mother Factory, a drug production facility so large it would fundamentally change the economics of illegal drug distribution in America. As the three of us sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back decades, I felt a rage building in my chest that had nothing to do with property rights or HOA harassment. These people had used my dying daughter's curiosity about our family's land to gather intelligence for their criminal enterprise. They planned to turn the farm Emma loved into a poison factory that would destroy countless lives. Karen's camping expedition hadn't been about intimidation or property acquisition. It had been a final reconnaissance mission before they began excavating the sealed entrances to Marcus's underground facility. But what they hadn't counted on was a grieving father who understood that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The sound of vehicles approaching my driveway interrupted our planning session. Through the kitchen window, I could see Karen's black SUV leading a convoy of construction vehicles toward my barn. They weren't waiting for legal proceedings or social media victories anymore. They were moving to the final phase of their operation, and they believed that one isolated farmer couldn't stop them. As I watched them begin unloading industrial equipment that wasn't designed for legitimate construction work, I realized that everything up to this point had been just the warm-up. The real fight was about to begin. The attack on my reputation came at dawn the next morning, swift and vicious as a coordinated military strike. Karen had uploaded new videos to every social media platform showing what appeared to be bags of methamphetamines and fentanyl hidden in my barn, along with photos of me supposedly meeting with known drug dealers. The images were professionally doctored, but convincing enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. Farmer reveals true colors, local man running drug operation from family farm, screamed the headline on a fake news website that had somehow gained thousands of shares overnight. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors, reporters, and people I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know if the allegations were true. By 8 a.m., the convoy of black SUVs was pulling into my driveway, and I knew my life was about to change forever. Federal agents poured out of the vehicles like they were raiding a terrorist compound, complete with bulletproof vests and assault rifles. The lead agent, a stern woman in her 40s, approached my front door with a warrant that gave them authority to search every inch of my property. "Mr. Colefield, I'm Agent Sarah Mitchell with the FBI. We have credible evidence that you're operating an illegal drug manufacturing facility on this property." The irony wasn't lost on me that they were looking for exactly what Karen was trying to build, but I wasn't in a position to explain the complexities of the situation while surrounded by armed federal agents. The search was thorough and humiliating. They went through Emma's room, photographing her belongings and treating her childhood memories like potential evidence in a criminal conspiracy. I watched helplessly as they dismantled parts of the barn where she'd spent countless hours caring for our animals, looking for the hidden drugs that Karen's fabricated evidence suggested were there. What hurt most was seeing the suspicion in the agents' eyes as they processed the scene. These were good people doing their jobs, but they were operating on false information that painted me as exactly the kind of criminal they dedicated their careers to stopping. Agent Mitchell remained professional but distant, treating me like a dangerous suspect rather than a victim of an elaborate frame-up. The low point came when they found the planted evidence, hidden behind hay bales in the exact location shown in Karen's photos. The agents discovered plastic bags containing what field tests confirmed were methamphetamines and fentanyl. The drugs had been placed there recently, and anyone familiar with my daily routine would know I rarely accessed that corner of the barn. But forensic evidence doesn't lie, and finding narcotics on my property gave the FBI everything they needed to justify an arrest. As Agent Mitchell read me my rights, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing at the edge of my property line, filming the entire arrest with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was unfolding perfectly. I spent 24 hours in federal custody, sitting in a concrete cell while my entire world collapsed around me. During my one phone call, I reached Rick Stone, who promised to contact Tommy and Agnes with updates on my situation. The local news had picked up the story by evening, and my arrest was the lead story on every channel from here to Columbus. Local farmer arrested in major drug investigation played on a loop, complete with helicopter footage of FBI agents searching my property and speculation about how long I'd been running a criminal enterprise from the farm Emma and I had built together. The public opinion that had been split during the social media war now swung decisively against me. How could anyone defend a farmer caught with drugs in his barn? But Karen had made a critical mistake in her rush to destroy me. Rick Stone called Tommy and Agnes while I was in custody, and together they reviewed the security camera footage from the night before my arrest. The cameras I'd installed to monitor my livestock had captured everything. Clear video showed Karen and two unknown men entering my barn at 3 a.m. carrying bags that they carefully placed behind the hay bales before leaving. Rick had the technical expertise to authenticate the footage and create timestamps that proved the drugs had been planted hours before the FBI raid. More importantly, Agnes revealed something that changed everything. She wasn't just a retired busybody with good observational skills. She was a retired D agent who'd moved to our rural community specifically to keep an eye on suspicious activities related to the old Marcus Whitmore facility. When Agent Mitchell returned to interview me the following morning, Agnes was waiting in the parking lot with a folder full of evidence and her retired federal credentials. "Sarah, we need to talk," Agnes said, greeting the FBI agent like an old colleague. "This entire operation is a setup, and we have proof." Within an hour, I was released from custody as Agnes presented the authenticated security footage, the historical documents about Marcus Whitmore's underground facility, and her intelligence about Karen's multi-state drug operation. Agent Mitchell's expression shifted from suspicion to embarrassment to professional interest as she realized the FBI had been manipulated into attacking the very person who could help them dismantle a major criminal enterprise. The revelation that Agnes had been monitoring the situation professionally for months added a new dimension to our fight against Karen's operation. She'd been building a case file on the fraudulent HOA schemes across multiple states, waiting for the right moment to coordinate with federal law enforcement. My arrest had accelerated her timeline, but it had also provided the perfect opportunity to bring the FBI into the investigation with full knowledge of what they were dealing with. As we left the federal building together, Agnes explained that Karen's operation was much larger than we'd imagined, with connections to international drug cartels and sufficient resources to corrupt local officials and manipulate federal investigations. But they'd also shown their hand by framing me, revealing capabilities and methods that would help law enforcement track down the entire network. Walking back to my truck in the federal building parking lot, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. I was free, but Karen was still out there with her construction equipment and her plans to excavate Marcus's underground facility. The FBI was now on our side, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and Karen had demonstrated a willingness to escalate the situation rapidly when threatened. As I drove home to survey whatever damage the search had done to my farm, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Karen had bet everything on framing me, and when she realized that Gambit had failed, there was no telling how desperate and dangerous she might become. The final confrontation came at dawn, exactly 72 hours after my release from federal custody. Agnes had spent those 3 days coordinating with Agent Mitchell and her team, while Karen's construction crew worked around the clock to excavate the sealed entrances to Marcus's underground facility. I could hear their heavy machinery grinding. Away at the earth near my eastern pasture, the sound carrying across the farm like a mechanical heartbeat, counting down to something terrible. But what Karen didn't know was that Agnes had convinced the FBI to let us spring one final trap, using my morning livestock routine as bait for an operation that would expose the full scope of their criminal enterprise on live video. I started my live stream at exactly 5:25 a.m., just like I'd done dozens of times since Emma's death, talking to my small but loyal audience about farm life and the simple pleasure of watching animals head to pasture. Good morning, folks. It's another beautiful day here in Ohio, and my cows and horses are ready for their morning constitutional. The chat was full of supportive comments from people who'd follow the drama of my arrest and vindication, but I noticed several new viewers with suspicious usernames that suggested Karen's people were monitoring my broadcast. Perfect. I wanted them to see everything that was about to happen. As I opened the barn gates, my 150 head of cattle and horses emerged like a four-legged cavalry charge, just as they had 3 months ago when this whole nightmare began, but this time, the thundering hooves were heading towards something far more significant than a few camping tents. Karen's excavation site was positioned directly in their path, complete with million-dollar industrial equipment designed to manufacture drugs on an unprecedented scale. I watched through my live stream as the construction crew looked up from their work and saw the approaching stampede with the kind of terror usually reserved for natural disasters. The chaos that followed was more spectacular than anything Hollywood could have produced. Bessie, my magnificent lead Holstein, charged directly into a piece of machinery that looked like something from a sci-fi movie, sending sparks flying and operators diving for cover. The rest of my herd followed her lead, scattering workers and destroying equipment with the relentless efficiency of nature reclaiming its territory. But unlike the camping incident 3 months ago, Karen wasn't screaming orders from the safety of a vehicle roof. She was standing in the middle of the excavation site, staring at the destroyed entrance to Marcus's underground facility with the blank expression of someone watching their life's work crumble into dust. The FBI moved in for directions, simultaneously emerging from concealed positions around my property like pieces of a perfectly orchestrated chess game. Agent Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. FBI, everyone on the ground, now. The construction workers who weren't running from my livestock were surrendering to federal agents, while Karen stood motionless in the center of it all. She looked older than her 52 years, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking to reveal the broken woman underneath. When Agent Mitchell approached her with handcuffs, Karen didn't resist. She simply whispered, Marcus ... I failed you again? The most satisfying moment came when David Brass, the corrupt councilman who'd been approving Karen's fraudulent HOA operations, tried to flee the scene with a briefcase full of cash. He made it about 50 yards before encountering my horses, who had spread out across the pasture in their post-stampede enthusiasm. I watched through my live stream as Brass, in his expensive suit and Italian shoes, attempted to outrun a quarter horse named Thunder, who seemed to think this was some kind of entertaining game. The chase ended with Brass face first in the farm pond, his briefcase spilling marked bills across the muddy water, while Thunder stood over him like a victorious General . As the FBI rounded up Karen's operation, the true scope of their criminal enterprise became clear. Agnes explained to my live stream audience that they'd just witnessed the takedown of the largest drug manufacturing conspiracy in federal history, with operations spanning 12 states and connections to Mexican cartels. The underground facility beneath my farm would have produced enough fentanyl to kill millions of people, distributed through a network of fake HOAs that had been systematically acquiring rural properties for 2 years. Karen wasn't just some grief-stricken widow trying to honor her husband's memory. She was the operational commander of a criminal organization that had been planning to poison America on an industrial scale. The emotional climax came when Agent Mitchell played Karen's final recording, a confession she'd left on her phone for her son. Through tears, Karen admitted that she'd wanted to build the largest drug empire in American history so her son could inherit a criminal legacy that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. But in her final moments of freedom, she realized she'd become exactly the kind of person Marcus had warned her about before his death. "I wanted to give you everything, baby," she sobbed into the recording, "but I became a monster instead." The live stream chat fell silent as people processed the tragedy of a mother whose love had twisted into something monstrous. The aftermath brought justice on multiple levels. Karen and her entire interstate network received federal sentences that would keep them in prison for decades. 12 fraudulent HOAs across 8 states were dismantled simultaneously, freeing dozens of farmers from legal harassment and returning millions of dollars in stolen property. I received substantial compensation from the federal government for the use of my farm in the investigation, money I used to establish the Emma Caulfield Center for Rural Drug Education, where families could learn about the dangers of substance abuse and the importance of protecting agricultural communities from criminal exploitation. Rick Stone's role in exposing the conspiracy earned him a promotion to federal agent, and Tommy Hayes won the Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting on rural drug trafficking networks. Most importantly, the Farmers Against Fake HOAs alliance that I founded with other victims became a nationwide advocacy group that helps rural communities identify and resist criminal organizations masquerading as legitimate authorities. Every morning when I release my animals to pasture, I remember Emma's dream of protecting the innocent, and I know she would be proud that our family farm became the place where one of America's most dangerous criminal enterprises was finally brought to justice. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from our deepest pain. Ethan's love for Emma didn't end with her passing. It transformed into the courage to protect others and honor her memory. His story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to stand up for what's right and build something meaningful from our loss. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up against overwhelming odds? How do you honor the memory of someone you've lost? Your stories matter to us and to this amazing community we're building together. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Happer Stories. When you share these stories with friends and family, you're helping spread hope and reminding people that good can triumph, even in the most impossible circumstances.